The tall man with white hair, a white beard, and dark sunglasses. Yes, the truth is getting out. Elvis is alive.
After Elvis Presley passed away in 1977, the world accepted the official report and moved on. But now, newly released FBI documents are challenging the narrative. Details from the real autopsy report are raising serious questions about what truly happened that day. Was it really from natural causes? Join us as we unravel the truth that has been hidden for nearly 50 years. The secret government file. There is a building in Washington, D.C. that holds some of the most sensitive documents in American history. Most of those files stay locked away for decades, hidden forever. But every so often, through legal pressure and public requests, a file gets released that was never meant to see the light of day. The file connected to Elvis Presley was one of those. It sat inside the FBI's system for years, filed away, while the world moved on and accepted the story it had been given about how the king of rock and roll passed away. The release of that file changed things in a very serious way. To understand why the FBI even had a file on Elvis, it helps to go back to the early years of his fame. Elvis became the biggest entertainer in the world very fast. By the late 1990s, his face was everywhere. His music was on every radio. His movies were filling theaters. But with that level of fame came a level of attention from powerful people in the government who were not fans. There were officials who believed Elvis was a bad influence on young Americans. So, some people in positions of power started paying closer attention to him. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, kept files on many famous Americans. Hoover believed it was his job to monitor anyone who had enough influence to shape public opinion or cause social disruption. Elvis fit that description perfectly. So a file was opened, agents collected information, and details were logged. Most of it seemed routine at the time, the kind of background noise that came with being famous in America during that era. But as the years went on, the file grew, and some of what went into it had nothing to do with concerts or fan behavior. Some of it went much deeper than that. By the time Elvis reached the 1970s, he was a very different person from the young man who had first walked into a recording studio in Memphis. He was struggling in ways that the public could sometimes see and sometimes could not. The people closest to him knew that his health was becoming a problem. Prescription medication had become a central part of his daily life. The number of pills he was taking on a regular basis had reached a level that alarmed the people around him. And yet he kept going, because stopping meant losing everything that had been built around him. What makes the FBI file so significant is not just that it existed, but that it contained information gathered from multiple sources over a long period of time. This was a collection of documented observations, communications, and records that painted a picture of a man whose situation was far more serious than the public ever understood. Some of the information in that file pointed directly at the kind of details that would have caused heavy damage if they had come out while Elvis was still alive or immediately after his demise. The process of getting the file released was not simple or fast. Requests had been made through the Freedom of Information Act over the years by researchers, journalists, and people with a serious interest in understanding what the government actually knew about Elvis. The FBI has the ability to withhold documents if releasing them is considered to be against the public interest, or if the information involves ongoing matters. For years, that wall held. People kept asking and kept being turned away with limited information or heavily edited pages that revealed almost nothing useful. When the release finally happened, it did not come with a press conference or a formal announcement. The files simply became accessible, the way many historical documents do, quietly and without ceremony. But the people who had been waiting for it noticed immediately. Researchers who had spent years studying Elvis's life and death began going through the pages carefully. What they found inside those pages was not what they had expected, and it was not something that could be explained away easily or dismissed as old gossip dressed up in official language. The timing of the release added another layer to the story. Nearly 5 decades had passed since Elvis passed away at his home in Memphis, Tennessee. Most of the people who were directly involved in the events of that period were either very old or no longer alive. The distance of time might have made it easier for the government to release the file, knowing that the immediate legal and political consequences would be lesser than they would have been in 1977, or even in the years shortly after. But that same distance made the contents of the file feel even more striking, because it showed just how long certain information had been kept away from the public. The file was real. The information inside it was documented and sourced, and once it was out, the story that the world had accepted about Elvis Presley for nearly 50 years began to look much less solid than it ever had before. And the truth couldn't wait to be out. The scripted lie. August 16, 1977, started like most summer days in Memphis, Tennessee. The city was going about its business. And at Graceland, the large white mansion on Elvis Presley's estate on the south side of the city, the day had begun in the way that days often did there during that period of Elvis's life. He had been awake through most of the night, as he often was. He had gone to bed in the late morning, and nobody thought the day was going to be different from any other. And then, in the early afternoon, everything changed in a moment that would freeze in time for millions of people around the world. The first call to emergency services went out at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. Paramedics arrived at Graceland and found Elvis unresponsive on the bathroom floor of his private suite. Efforts to revive him were made on the scene and continued on the way to Baptist Memorial Hospital, which was not far from the estate. At the hospital, a team of doctors worked on him. But there was nothing that could be done. Elvis Aaron Presley was pronounced deceased that same afternoon. He was 42 years old. The news hit the outside world within the hour and spread with a speed that was incredible. The official statement released shortly after his passing described the cause as cardiac arrhythmia, which is an irregular heartbeat. It pointed to a heart failure as the primary reason his body had stopped functioning. Given that Elvis had known heart issues and had been under enormous physical strain for years, this explanation was not hard for most people to accept on the surface. A man who had lived the way Elvis lived, with the pressures and the excesses that came with his lifestyle, dying of heart failure at 42 was sad but not entirely shocking to many people who had been watching from a distance. The funeral moved with unusual speed. Elvis passed away on a Tuesday and was buried on Thursday, just 2 days later. The speed of the burial was explained as necessary, given the heat of the Memphis summer and the number of people expected to gather. Tens of thousands of fans came to Memphis in those 2 days. They lined the streets outside Graceland, standing under the heat for hours to pay their respects. People wept openly in the streets of a city that had given Elvis to the world. The scale of the mourning matched the scale of the man's fame, and it filled every television screen in America and beyond. The medical examiner who handled the case was a man with solid professional credentials and a serious reputation in his field. His initial findings pointed toward the cardiac explanation, but the amount of prescription medication found in Elvis's system at the time of his demise was significant. Toxicology reports done in the days following his demise showed the presence of multiple medications at levels that were difficult to ignore. But those results were not made fully public in the immediate aftermath, and the cardiac explanation remained the dominant story. The people who were present at Graceland on that day, and in the hours that followed, were not speaking freely to the press. The estate went into a kind of protective lockdown in the emotional chaos of those first hours. The people who managed Elvis's affairs were focused on handling the immediate logistics of what had happened. Public statements were kept short and controlled. The grief inside the estate was genuine, but so was the awareness that everything connected to Elvis Presley had financial and reputational value, and that value was now in a very delicate position. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, was the head of the family and the person who oversaw decisions in the immediate aftermath. He was a grieving father, and that grief was visible and real. But the decisions made around the handling of Elvis's medical records and the public communication about the cause of death were decisions made in a very short window of time by people who were not in a calm or clear-headed state. Some of the choices made in those 48 hours would cast a shadow over the official story for decades. The medical records connected to Elvis's demise were sealed relatively quickly after the initial reports were filed. In Tennessee, the laws around medical privacy allowed for this, and the Presley estate had both the motivation and the legal standing to limit public access to sensitive documents. This meant that the full toxicology report, the complete findings of the examination, and other critical medical details stayed out of reach for most people who were trying to understand what had really happened. What the public had was the official statement, and for many years, that was all most people knew. The story that settled into public memory was one of a great man brought down too soon by a body that had been pushed past its limits. It was a story that honored Elvis without asking too many difficult questions. It allowed the people who had been close to him to grieve without facing the harder parts of what had led to that bathroom floor in Memphis on a hot Tuesday afternoon in August. The world accepted it because it was given nothing else to work with, and the file sitting inside the FBI's record system stayed exactly where it was, waiting. Inside the FBI report, when researchers began working through the pages of the FBI file on Elvis Presley after its release, the first thing they noticed was the large volume of documented detail. The file had grown over many years and contained material from multiple sources, multiple time periods, and multiple areas of concern. Some sections dealt with security threats Elvis had received. Other sections dealt with his associations and professional relationships. But the sections that drew the most serious attention were the ones connected to the final years of his life and the medical picture that emerged from the documented observations. One of the most striking elements in the file was the documentation around prescription medication. The official story had acknowledged that Elvis used prescription pills, but it had framed this as a personal health issue that contributed to the strain on his heart. The FBI file framed it very differently. The documentation inside the file described a pattern of pharmaceutical use that had been ongoing for years, at a level that multiple medical professionals had flagged as dangerous. What made this significant was not just the information itself, but the fact that this information existed in a government file, meaning that people in positions of federal authority had access to knowledge about Elvis's medical situation long before he passed away. Meanwhile, the file also contained material that touched on the doctors who had been prescribing medication to Elvis in large quantities over an extended period of time. Without naming specific individuals, the documents described a network of medical professionals whose prescribing behavior around Elvis had raised concerns internally. There were notes suggesting that the volume of controlled substances being prescribed to one individual had come to the attention of people who monitored pharmaceutical distribution for signs of misuse or illegal activity. This part of the file was particularly significant because it pointed to a situation that went beyond Elvis himself and involved the professional conduct of licensed medical practitioners. The toxicology section of the file, which contained information that went further than what had been released publicly in 1977, described medication levels in Elvis's system at the time of his passing that painted a very different picture from the cardiac arrhythmia explanation. The presence of multiple substances at significant concentrations pointed toward a conclusion that the medical examiner's initial public findings had either understated or deliberately set aside. The combination of substances documented in the file was one that medical professionals reviewing the report after its release described as being inconsistent with simple heart failure as a primary cause. There was also material in the file related to the speed and manner in which the scene had been handled before official investigators arrived. The documentation described a period of time between when Elvis was found and when emergency services were called that raised questions about what had happened in those minutes and what decisions had been made. The file did not make direct accusations, but the timeline documented inside it did not align cleanly with the timeline that had been presented to the public in the days following. Perhaps the most difficult section of the file to read was the one that documented internal communications from the period immediately following Elvis's demise. These communications showed that people within federal oversight structures were aware of information that contradicted the public narrative. The decision to allow the official story to stand without challenge or public correction was not made out of ignorance. It was made by people who had access to a fuller picture and chose not to bring that picture forward. The file did not explain why that choice was made, but it made clear that the choice was intentional. The release of this material forced a re-examination of how the case had been classified and communicated to the public. Medical and legal professionals who reviewed the file after its release were consistent in their assessment that the documented evidence pointed toward a cause of death that was more directly connected to acute toxicity than to cardiac failure as an independent event. The heart stopping was real, but what caused the heart to stop was a more complex and more troubling story than the one that had been told for nearly 50 years. The file also raised serious questions about accountability. If federal authorities had access to information showing that the health situation around Elvis had reached a crisis level before his passing, and if that information was documented and filed, then the question of why no intervention occurred became impossible to ignore. All these discrepancies were small individually, but together they formed a pattern that was suspicious. However, one of the enabling factors was the people around Elvis at the time. The burden of silence. In the weeks and months after Elvis passed away, a small number of people sat with information that the rest of the world did not have. These were people who had been inside Elvis's life in very direct ways. Some of them had been with him for years. Some of them had professional relationships with him that came with legal and ethical obligations. Some of them were family, and almost all of them, for a very long time, stayed quiet about certain parts of the story. This resulted from the world that existed around Elvis in his final years, and the pressures that came with being close to the most famous entertainer on earth. The people who worked in and around Graceland during the 1970s operated inside a very specific culture. Elvis was the center of everything. His mood set the tone for the day. His needs came first. The people around him understood that their lives, their incomes, and their sense of purpose were all connected to him in ways that made it very difficult to separate their own judgment from their loyalty to him. When something went wrong, the first instinct was to protect him and to protect the environment he had built. This was not unique to Elvis's world. It was a pattern common to people who spent years in close orbit around someone with enormous power and fame. But in Elvis's case, that protective instinct had very serious consequences. The doctors involved in Elvis's medical care in the years before his passing were in a very complicated position. They were licensed professionals with obligations to their patients' health and safety. But they were also dealing with a patient who was one of the most powerful and influential figures in American popular culture. Elvis was not a typical patient. He was a man who would push back against any medical professional who tried to restrict his access to things he wanted. The doctors who stayed in his orbit and continued to prescribe medication in the quantities they did made choices that the FBI filed documents in detail. Some of those doctors faced professional scrutiny years after. Licenses were affected in some cases, but the full extent of what had happened medically was never brought clearly into public view because the records that would have made the strongest case were sealed. The people who might have testified most directly about what they knew were protected by the same privacy structures that kept the medical records from becoming public. The system that should have provided accountability instead provided cover. The people who had been closest to Elvis personally faced a different kind of silence. They had watched him decline. They had seen the changes in his body, his behavior, and his ability to function. Some of them had expressed concern at various points and had been pushed away or ignored. By the time the end came, many of them were exhausted and grief-stricken in a way that made clear thinking nearly impossible. The official explanation allowed everyone to grieve without having to face the more painful and more complicated truth of what had really happened and who bore responsibility for it. There were also financial considerations that cannot be ignored when trying to understand why silence held for so long. The Elvis Presley estate became massively valuable after his demise, in ways that surprised even the people managing it. The music rights, the image rights, the ongoing commercial value of everything connected to his name built into a financial structure worth hundreds of millions of dollars over time. Any serious public challenge to the official story of how he passed away carried the risk of legal and reputational damage that could affect that financial structure. The culture of loyalty that had defined life around Elvis did not disappear when his life ended. It carried forward into the decades that followed. People who had been part of his inner circle continued to protect the version of the story they had agreed to carry. When books were written and documentaries were made and interviews were given, the same careful boundaries held. Certain things were consistently avoided. Anyone watching closely over the years could see the shape of what was not being said, even if the specific details remained hidden. What the FBI file did was provide documented confirmation of things that some people had suspected or partially known for years. It gave concrete form to the outlines that had been visible, but never provable. The release of the file did not force any immediate public reckoning, as most of the people involved were either very old or no longer alive. However, the file made their silence permanent and visible. The documents showed what they had known and chosen not to speak. And the combination of those two things created a collective silence around one of the most famous deaths in modern history that was very difficult to look at directly.